Hi, my name is Mark and welcome to The Active Listener, where we aim to listen, not just hear. We firmly believe that everyone has an interesting story to tell, if given the space to do so. So listening to what our guests have to say, you may learn something.
Hi, Mark. Thank you. I'm Sarah Custance. I work at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. My job is in the portfolio office. The portfolio office help the company to decide on the projects and programs they want to run and then help bring them to life and deliver them successfully. My role is as a portfolio business partner. So I partner with one part of the business to make sure that their part of the portfolio is delivered. As part of that, my interest in coaching has led me to do an apprenticeship, and I use that both in terms with how I deal with my wider stakeholders and particularly in terms of how I approach my line management.
Hi, I'm Lucy Chambers. I'm a Principal Research Officer in the Research Division at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. We do a variety of research projects for different product areas of the business. I manage a small team of researchers as well as coaching. I also use those skills in sort of management and project management as well.
Both extremely busy, so thank you for giving your time up today. I also know you're both really good coaches, so I thought it'd be quite useful to explore elements of coaching. And one of the things that has come up in previous conversations is the whole kind of area of boundaries and dynamics in conversation. How do you broach being a coach at work and being a colleague? Because often when people go and see coaches, it'll be to a coach that's their main job and it'll be outside the context of work. So how do you manage that within a workplace?
I think one of the things that I do is not coach anyone that I'm particularly close to or that I know well, or I know perhaps some of their colleagues well. I'll always avoid those relationships. So most of my coachees are people who I either don't know at all or only know in a very kind of an acquaintance way. Managing time is also a thing as well, about sort of blocking out certain times in my calendar and switching off notifications, etc. So that time is purely kept for coaching. And then also in the conversations themselves, keeping those boundaries in place such that when I'm talking to them, I have my coach hat on and I am a coach and not a colleague. And it's keeping that in mind, especially if perhaps some of the conversations might get quite personal. And if I was having that conversation with a colleague, I'd be happy to sort of sit and listen to them. Whereas in that coaching situation, it's breaking our initial contract. And I have to be kind of very mindful about keeping me as a coach in that conversation and directing that conversation elsewhere if that person needs additional support.
I'd agree with all of that, Lucy. I think for me, one of the really key points is that when we enter a coaching conversation, we're very, very clear about the contracting. By contracting, I mean when we start a relationship with a potential coachee, we're very clear to them about what we as a coach will bring to it, what we expect from them as a coachee, what the boundaries and the structure of the relationship will look like. And that contracting helps build in some boundaries for us as the coach and for the coachees. And it helps both sides to understand that it's not just a normal conversation they're coming into, and that it may feel a bit different, and that it needs to be maybe approached differently, and that it protects both parties.
So it seems to me there's something there about basically being clear that the contract is to make everyone aware of what is actually going on, what the expectations are. And it sounds like it's kind of a safety net in one sense of where you're going forward in conversations.
That's correct. It's not, I think, overstepping my experience or my skill set, and ensuring the coachee has the best experience and is served well.
I think, yeah, it helps to differentiate. We wear different hats. We have our hats that we wear in our day job, and even in those, we have different hats. We have our line management hat. Then we have in my case, I have my business partnering hat. Lucy will have her researching, and you use them interchangeably. And sometimes you have conversations with people, and it's not clear which hat they have on. And that can make it really difficult because you don't understand the agenda, you don't understand the context. It's really important within the coaching conversation that all of that is explicit and it's in the open and understood by all parties.
From what I've seen over time, there's often this sort of blurring of edges in regards to mentoring, coaching, teaching, counselling. And whilst they're defined things in their own right, there are these sometimes little mergy bits. How do you approach that in conversations, particularly as you're starting to get to know the coachee and maybe they've sort of developed a bit of rapport with you? How do you navigate that space if they start to go down perhaps a line that you don't feel comfortable with?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's something that is very difficult when you start out coaching, and it's something that your experience teaches you how to deal with. The first key part is recognizing that there is a flag there for you. So there's something about that self-management as a coach, recognizing triggers or boundaries that are being crossed. And I guess when we start out on our coaching journey, sometimes we don't realize that until afterwards. And so it's only in reflection afterwards that you realize why you were struggling so much with a conversation maybe, and that you can then identify what those triggers are likely to be for you, and you can manage them better in the next conversation. But it's part for me of the reason that we have chemistry sessions with coachees before we start, so that you get a sense of how you're going to feel in that conversation, and whether you're going to have a kind of good sense of alignment, or whether those conversations are likely to feel comfortable for you as a coach. Because as much as the coaching conversation is focused on the coachee, if the coach can't be authentic in that conversation, then it's not going to work as effectively. But whilst trying to be authentic and bring as much of yourself as you can into the conversation, we as coaches still have to make sure we're maintaining those boundaries, and that we don't flip over, as you say, into either mentoring or counselling. And what I found is, although it's difficult and it feels unnatural, maybe, it's okay to say, I'm not sure I like where this is going, and to maybe reframe it, or use some of the techniques that we would use generally in coaching conversations to try and pull something back away from a boundary. If I guess it becomes clear that a coachee has a need for counselling or mentoring, then it's okay for us to point them in that direction and to offer them places that they can go to. But it would be inappropriate for us to try and fulfill that need.
There's notion of intuition, and that we often use this about our coachees and respond to things they say, things they do. And it's turning that intuition on yourself and your own responses. And so if you do have that, I think you mentioned that feel of discomfort when you don't want to go there, listen to that and respond to it, because you may not be able to mentally process what's going on in the moment, but tuning into your own responses will help you navigate that situation, I think.
It sounds like to me then there's something about being emotionally aware, sort of being aware of yourself as well as the individual, and having those good, healthy boundaries in place. What about in regards to communication in a session?
It's an interesting one, because I've only ever coached through the camera and through a a sort of electronically mediated session, so I can't compare it to a face-to-face session. But I think perhaps you do listen more, and perhaps you are more in tune to facial expressions. And because you don't see the arms very often at all, when they do come up and someone starts gesturing, then it's always more of a signal that something's happening. Whereas if perhaps you've had the whole body in front of you, you might not tune in as much. I don't know.
There's definitely something for me about the position of the camera and the fact that you may think you're looking at someone, but you're not. If your camera isn't where their image is on the screen, then they don't think you're looking at them. And so I do think it can be problematic around eye contact, and that can maybe, if you're not careful from the coach's perspective, give the wrong impression to the coachee. Mehrabian's communication rule tells us that in terms of interpreting what people are saying, the communication we hear, only 7% of that is really to do with words. The rest is about how you're saying it and about the body language. And in fact, over half of it is about body language. That piece that Lucy said about really tuning in to what you're seeing on the screen and whether someone's still, whether their head's going down, or whether they become more animated, they start to talk a bit more enthusiastically, maybe a bit louder. You know, you can really hear the difference. As a coach, we need to recognize that. We need to think about what it's telling us, and then we need to respond appropriately. And one of the things is sort of matching that energy that we're seeing and feeling. If someone is starting to look down and, you know, seeming to be less confident or less happy with what they're saying, for us to continue being smiley and bouncy and whatever would feel wrong. And, you know, we need to adjust to how the coachee is, and then use other techniques around the way that we question and the way we guide the conversation, maybe to try and get a shift in that if we're recognizing that it's a problem.
So what you're talking about there, it seems, it's not just about recognizing how someone is feeling or thinking from how they behave and what they're actually saying, or the tone of what they're saying, but it's also about your response to what they're portraying. So you spoke about, you know, their voice and whatnot. How you respond to that is just as important.
I think it's also not over-interpreting that. It's recognizing that something's changed for the coachee. So it's one example where someone would have a particular facial response. And to begin with, I over-interpreted that as having a negative response, whereas I realized it wasn't. It was just a shift. It's that kind of that danger to read too much into it, and to just acknowledging that it's a change, and you can then explore what that change is.
It can be really useful to say to the coachee, I can see that that's really, you know, you've got energy from that. You know, tell me about why you've lit up as you're saying that. You know, tell me about what's going on there. And it can help unlock something that a coachee hadn't previously been aware of.
So there's this whole thing about being aware of yourself, aware of what's coming through in terms of the conversation because of the way someone's portraying or coming across. We've spoken there about boundaries and being clear what the purpose of the coaching conversation is, and having that contracting and that chemistry session, as you put it, this, you know, where you're getting to know someone as to, is this going to work, not just from their perspective, but from your perspective as well. How do you identify something as an energy shift within the room?
I think it's a mix of things. It is the body language. It's the maybe a facial expression or a movement or non-movement. It could just be a stillness or a deep breath. I think for me, it's just something that's changed. That you perhaps when you've had, say, 1 or 2 sessions with someone, you kind of have a sort of baseline idea of their general way of presenting themselves to you on the screen. And it's noticing those shifts from that, as well as the way they present on that day.
I think there's a number of indicators. The pace of the conversation, if someone's speeding up or slowing down, that could be a sign. That there'll be the non-verbals, the sighs, or it could be the shoulders dropping or the head going down. It could be the sort of language that they're using. The metaphors that they choose could change from those that are kind of positive to ones that feel more negative. Going from a glass half full to a glass half empty, so to speak. And it's a combination. It's spotting which ones change. As Lucy says, it's about the change.
And to me, spotting those energy shifts from experience in the sense of how long you've been coaching per se, but also perhaps how long you've been coaching that individual. So you may have that first 1 or 2 sessions and you'll pick up in the conversation slight change of tone because you've spoken about a certain thing. But from what you're saying, I'm kind of interpreting at least that as you get to know that individual more, you're going to be able to recognise the differences. Well, today they're a lot more subdued compared to the last time we met, or I noticed they're not quite as happy about this certain situation.
You perhaps will recognise the more subtle changes that you might have missed earlier on as well.
I think that's true, and I think it's important for us as coaches to maintain the boundaries. We have to notice and react to them, but as we start to be more aware of those subtleties, there's a danger that we interpret that almost as sort of friendship or an intimacy, I suppose, that we then have to be aware that we keep the right level of boundaries and we self-manage as a coach so that we don't get sort of too drawn into the coachee's energy. We mirror, but we've still got to be in control.
Let's say you've had a coaching session, they may have been crying or it's just something heavy they've been discussing that they're working on with yourself as a goal. How do you go about managing your own well-being?
This is something I've thought about a lot, because there are other scenarios in life where you might have a stressful situation or something might happen, and there is a tendency to kind of for that to replay in your mind and go over it and over it again. Whereas I've found in coaching, I don't do that. And I was quite interested as to why I don't do that. And I put it down to 2 things. One is an initial reflection after the session. When the session's finished, I write down and have a reflective time thinking about what's happened, and I actively write it down. I think the writing helps as well. And also a secondary thing is the fact that I know that I've been present in that session and as present as I can be. And so any question I've asked or anything I've done with the fullest intention and with my full presence that I can give. And so that if afterwards I do suddenly think, I shouldn't have perhaps said that, or I should have asked a question a different way, or I didn't pick up on that, I then can tune that as a development thing rather than as something I did wrong. And knowing that I've been as fully present as I can be enables me to do that. And so I don't have these kind of dwelling thoughts that I might have after, I don't know, a job interview or something like that.
I think that self-reflection is key for me as well, Lucy. Similar to you, after a coaching conversation, I always make time. I make sure I have time for that reflection, that I can note any feelings that came up for me during the session, and particularly those where there was something more triggering. If it's broached difficult subjects like, bullying at work or anything else that coachee has got, really emotional about, it gives me a chance to really try and process that for myself and my reaction to it. And there are the learning points, the development points, as you say, about how could I, if something similar happened again, how can I deal with it better? But I think another key point for me is that as internal coaches, we have a day job and we only coach occasionally. It's not that we coach all day, every day. And so the burden on us, although it means that it will take us longer to get really experienced and to learn more of those self-management things and how we build our resilience and take care of our well-being, it also means there's less of a threat to those things because we have our coaching conversation, we reflect on it, and then we put a different hat on and we go and do something else. So I think there's less danger of it building for us in the situation that we're in.
Is there an element there because you have to kind of drop it in one sense because you do have this other role that you're putting the hat on and then going in to do?
It provides a time boxing. It means that we have to be disciplined. If we were not doing it successfully, I'm sure it would bleed over. As Lucy says, in other areas, you might end up still going, what if, should I have, and replaying things. So there will always be the danger of that. But I guess it allows us to compartmentalise maybe a little more.
To pick up on Sarah's point that it is that kind of boundary of, in my diary, I schedule a reflection session afterwards. And so nothing will happen in that, or nothing else will clash with it in terms of other scheduling. And so it is that kind of space, and that's what I do in that space. And I think that's helpful to have that dedicated, pre-allocated time.
I think in the way that Lucy spoke of needing to be present for the coachee when we're conducting that coaching conversation, the self-reflection time that we both diarise after a conversation gives us time to be present for ourselves, which, again, to Lucy's point that maybe she doesn't replay things because she's been present in that conversation. I think because then we dedicate that time for reflection, we can do it more effectively, and then it's done.
Yeah, I think that's spot on.
What about coaching training ongoing as this sort of continued development, continued process, things that you can do to broaden your understanding, to improve yourself as a coach? With any subject, you should continually be learning. You never get there, you'll get to a certain level, but if you want to be better and extend, that's how you just keep growing, a sort of educational mindset.
The really interesting bit for me there is about, as a coach, it's one thing to learn a new model, a new technique. It's quite something else putting it into practice in a coaching conversation where your need as a coach to try something is conflicting with your need to be really present and focused on the coachee. And we need to then balance that and accept, that part of it is about being kind to yourself, that you can try something and if it doesn't work, actually that's okay. But you're obviously so focused on providing the best you can for your coachee that there's always a conflict there. And so that there's the desire to be learning and growing as a coach, but that difficulty in terms of how that actually translates into a conversation.
What you're saying there about wanting what's best for the coachee, it reminds me of a doctor. So I would like to think the doctors have wanted what's best for me. The various medications I've tried, it's often been walking together to try and work out, right, what balance of medication is going to manage this epilepsy. Okay, and there's this kind of playing around, right? It's this dose, it's this med, and you're taking that time to try and work out what's right, and that will vary from person to person. I think really what comes to mind is when you're sort of talking there, Sarah, is that perhaps that's the same when it comes to a coaching model. whether it's different for different people because of the nature of the person, but also different per session and subject. Perhaps there is that element sometimes, well, we test the water there, see where that's going. Actually, no, solutions focus isn't going to work there. It's going to be a much more coactive model.
It's kind of feeling your way sometimes, and just doing what's best. But I also think because we are coaching internally, we're actually in a very privileged position that we've got each other in terms of we can meet and try things out, discuss things, in terms of models and methods and ways of doing things. So I think that's one of the advantages of coaching as internal coaches, that we have that support from each other.
I totally agree, and I think for our well-being, that's been a really key part for me. That we've had, we've had an action learning set that we can fall back on, and that feeling that you're not alone, and that you've got somewhere you can take those questions and queries to a group of people who will understand where you're coming from and the context without you having to explain it, and not necessarily like-minded because you want a different point of view, but a supportive group that's meant a lot to me.
That explains why supervision is so important. What you're talking about is a community of practice, really, isn't it? In terms of you don't go into the details of someone, it's obviously confidential, but you're coming with different approaches and so on. Whereas if you're someone who's operating individually, self-employed, again, that would be why it's so important to have that supervision. Whereas in the community of practice, you've got one another plus supervision as well. So there is that real element of support. I guess before we go, we just have to see if you have your favourite 5 each, and also each of you tell me something you're proud of or an unusual fact about yourself.
In terms of something I'm proud of, it's setting up the Disability and Neurodiversity Ambassador Scheme at work, which is a peer-to-peer support network, which is something I feel very passionately about. And I work with some great colleagues to get that set up, and that's something I'm proud of.
The thing I'm proud of is much more personal and frankly more trivial than that. When I was at sixth form, I'd come from a school that didn't value academic achievement. And although I'd done okay in previous exams, there was no pressure to stretch yourself and so I had coasted a little. And I then, one of the A levels that I decided to do because I loved the subject was maths. And the step up from a school that had very little rigour to one that was doing an A level properly was really very big. And I struggled quite a lot. Did incredibly badly in my mocks. I think probably the lowest score they've ever seen in a mock. And the school refused to enter me into the A level. So my parents had to pay for me to enter the exam, and I passed. I did only get an E, but that was a pass. And that, to this day, is something that I'm very proud of.
Favourite song or piece of music?
I don't have a favourite, but I have one that's kind of popped up in my life. And it's one that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is turn on the radio. And I went through a period of my 20s that whenever this song came on the radio, something would happen in my life that changed its direction. And that song was the Boo Radleys' Wake Up Boo. And that's responsible for me going to Australia, for becoming an EFL teacher, and all sorts of life-changing things.
Wow.
Amazing.
Wow, have you written to them to let them know what an impact?
It's lost its effect now. I hear it now and it doesn't. I just reminisce and be nostalgic.
My family will tell you that they'd be surprised I'm even answering this question, because I hate saying I have favourites, because it depends on my mood, and I like lots of things, and I don't like to pick a favourite. But the one that keeps coming back to me when I was thinking about it is Somebody to Love by Queen. I went to see Queen at Wembley Stadium when I was a teenager, and Freddie Mercury was an amazing showman. And that song, I've heard various versions of it. I think George Michael did it in the Freddie Mercury tribute concert, and recently I've heard a Foo Fighters version. They're all amazing. I think it's an amazing song, and it's one of those that I want to sing along to every time I hear it.
Hero or person you most admire?
Again, I don't have a hero. I think with the current situation in the world, people who I admire are the ones taking in refugees from Ukraine and opening their families up.
That's a great answer.
Yeah.
I think again, this is just an example of a number of people. The person that comes to mind is Doreen Lawrence, Stephen Lawrence's mum, purely because of the dignity and purpose that she's had since, a tragic, awful event that could have made so many people, or would have made so many people, bitter and introspective. And she has absolutely carried herself, as I say, with dignity throughout, and achieved so much as a result of that. And I just look at her as a fantastic example.
So, food.
Has to be a roast dinner. We had them every weekend as children, and we still have one now. It has to be potatoes. That's probably the key element that has to be good.
The jewel in the crown, the roast potato.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I'll follow that with a really good cheese board then, because I think for me it would have to be cheese.
I'm getting hungry now. Place.
Definitely by the sea. It's a place I feel calmest, and walking along the coast on a sunny day with the wind blowing is that sort of perfect situation.
Mine's surprisingly similar, actually, but I wouldn't limit it to sea. It's water. It's anything around water. I agree. There's a calmness, or there can be a power to it if it's moving. But it for me it introduces a sense of space that you can't get through anything else. I like to be in it. I like to be on it. I like to be next to it.
There's something about being outside, isn't there? And as you say, the space and the sound. Favorite book, film, or video game?
The book I've chosen is one that I read in my 20s. It was one I was traveling, and the hostels always have a bookcase, and I picked this one up and read it. Knew nothing about it, and it had a real impact on me. Floods of tears reading it, and it's Scallygrig by William Horwood, and it's the first time that I'd come across disability in a fictional character in a book, and some of the characters have cerebral palsy. It's about the way they're treated, about the perceptions, and it also has this kind of mythical or spiritual element of this person that assists them, and it just had a bit of a strong impact.
Has that influenced your involvement as well with the disability ambassadors?
I don't know if it influenced, but it's been one of these books that's been in the back of my head most of my life.
I struggled more with this one. I guess the obvious one for me to say is probably Captain Corelli's Mandolin, which I very much enjoyed reading when I read it. I have only read it once, but I happened to be reading it in a hotel bar the night that I met my husband. And so it has a it has a resonance for me, not just as a great book, but in terms of the timing when I was reading it. I do like games which have sort of beautiful graphics. There is one called Unraveled that my daughter loves, and there's just something very gentle about the way that it's animated, which I quite like. I find it very calming. Most games have the opposite effect on me.
Well, look, thank you both for a really insightful conversation, and that's got me thinking anyway. So it's been lovely talking to you both.
It's the opportunity to have this discussion. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. I agree.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. It's been really good, and we'll have to do it again. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. Until next time, remember, help people feel valued. Listen, don't just hear.